I gotta do my counter. Hello, everybody. This is Empowering Democracy. I'm your host, Joe Firestone, and I'm joined by Dee Pierce, the host of Around the World with Dee and Friends. Hello, Dee. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing fine. How are you doing tonight, Joe?
I am doing pretty well.
How's Bonnie doing?
She's doing pretty well also. Of course, her eyes are irritated and inflamed, but
Mm,
the doctor said that she did very well during the operation and
oh, good.
all was normal. Now she's taking the medication they gave her and just trying to recover. I think one of the biggest problems now is just recovering from all of the dilation drops that they gave her
Oh
for
my
this
goodness.
type of surgery. They really want to dilate your eyes completely, and they kept on giving her rounds of dilation drops.
Mm,
So, I mean, she must have had 4 rounds while I was sitting here. And that was before they took her into surgery. In other words,
oh my goodness.
in the pre-op section, they
Mm-hmm.
gave her 4 rounds of dilation drops, okay, and antibiotics,
Okay.
okay, and also drops for numbing her eyes.
Right.
So there were 4 rounds of those before she even walked in.
Mm,
And then I think they gave her some more also.
hmm
And but she hardly felt anything during the surgery, okay, at all. And she's generally been in good spirits. She was sitting here till a moment ago. I think she'll be back in a little while.
Okay.
We both took a nap this afternoon, so uh, which was a good thing because we had to wake up at 5:45 in the morning to get started to go there.
Oh my goodness. What an early morning.
Yeah, and it was a lucky thing because when we got out there, uh, there was ice on the car, and it must have taken 10 minutes to defrost it.
Oh my gosh.
So we lost a little time there in getting started. But we still got there about a half hour early, which was always good.
Oh, yeah, you like to get there early.
Yeah.
Well, just to get, you don't want the stress.
Yeah, if you get there early, you don't have the stress as, you're approaching the surgery. So that was good.
Mm-hmm.
So things are looking good right now. We have a follow up appointment with the doctor tomorrow at
Okay.
10. So we'll be able to sleep at least a little later to
Mm-hmm.
get to that one. So that will be good. But we still have to go to bed earlier tonight. We got 3 comments. Uh, there's Kay, and she says she's glad to see you, and she greets both you and I.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that.
Oh, okay. Yes.
So tonight, what I wanted to talk about was some other aspects of the corruption. Uh, First, something being done about the lack of regulation in the federal government.
Mm,
The DOJ and the FTC are putting together merger guidelines. I think those are guidelines for them working together to actually enforce the regulatory laws. So uh, I know the FTC people are very enthusiastic about the new guidelines for doing this. and the FTC people are very serious about making regulation effective.
Mm-hmm.
They're led, by Lena Khan, and she's really, really sincere about that and very effective in her job. One of the best appointments that Biden made, and I think one of the best things he did as president, was to appoint her as the head of the FTC. Then we're also going to talk about what the billionaires are trying to do to people they perceive as the socialists who have gotten into Congress, how they're planning to spend a whole bunch of money in order to defeat them. Then for the rest of the show, what I wanted to deal with, was the very brief pronouncements that were made by Robert F. Kennedy in the interview he had with Crystal Ball and Sagar Enjeti. It was about 52 minutes in, and he put in a sentence or two on how he felt about, getting rid of the filibuster.
Mm-hmm.
I mentioned, in an earlier broadcast that what he said, was really ridiculous. But, tonight I wanted to go much more deeply into that, the arguments against the point that he was making. Now, I wrote about that back in 2009 in a few columns, that I did. So I pulled up a couple of the old columns and I was going to go through them here.
Okay.
But let us start with the FTC and the DOJ and what they've been doing to come together, because I think that's very interesting. My camera's gone. Something happened to my camera, and I don't know why.
Oh,
But hopefully I corrected the problem now. So anyway, I'm going to present the first of our pieces tonight. Specifically a piece from Common Dreams on the FTC, Federal Trade Commission, DOJ,
okay.
Department of Justice, the merger guidelines aiming to restore competition, where competition is very rarely seen, these days. This is a picture, of Lena Khan, who is the chair of the Federal Trade Commission, speaking during a New York Times annual Deal Book Summit on November 29th, 2023 in New York City. And the headline is FTC DOJ merger guidelines aim to restore competition and strengthen democracy. So, of course, that's fully in line with our theme of empowering democracy here. One expert called the guidance, quote, a game changer for antitrust enforcement, incorporating decades of new learnings and thousands of public comments from working families and small businesses, unquote. And this article is by Jessica Corbett. It was written on December 18th, 2023. Antitrust campaigners and experts on Monday celebrated the Biden administration's new guidelines for mergers and acquisitions, which supporters say will, quote, restore competition and strengthen democracy, unquote. I sure hope so, because one of the scandals of the last 40 years has been just allowing people who want to do mergers and acquisitions go on a rampage. And that's led to extreme concentration in our business environment, and also into situations where the merged companies would basically loot the subsidiary companies and fire a whole bunch of people on the way to their reducing competition in their industries. It was really a tragedy and a travesty at the same time. Farm Action co-founder and chief strategy officer Joe Maxwell commended the Federal Trade Commission, FTC, and the U.S. Department of Justice, DOJ, quote, for delivering on their commitment to restore competition to our economy. I think the congratulations may be a little premature, because what they've done is to put together the guidelines. That doesn't mean that they're going to follow them and restore competition. For more than 40 years, the merger guidelines have been void of a review for competition. Imagine that. That's a quote unquote there. He said, quote, again, during this period of time, unprecedented concentration across U.S. markets has driven farmers and small businessmen out of business. True words were never spoken. Eric Peinert, research manager and editor at the American Economic Liberties Project. By the way, that's a really good project, a really good organization. And the research they do is very good. The advocacy, is very good. They've been a big supporter, of Lena Khan. And I think that some of their staff have managed to move over to the Federal Trade Commission to staff that and improve the performance of the Federal Trade Commission. Anyway, Peinert declared that, quote, the finalized merger guidelines are a game changer for antitrust enforcement, incorporating decades of new learnings and thousands of public comments from working families and small businesses, unquote. After almost 50 years of significant under-enforcement, we're thrilled to see the antitrust agencies make a comprehensive update to the merger guidelines and look forward to seeing them vigorously enforced, unquote. He continued, quote, the new guidelines provide a roadmap to bring first principles of the antitrust laws into the 21st century. Well, I'm sure that's a roadmap that the federal government really needs to have. It's just a wonder it took so long for them to get it. Quote, previous guidelines ignored or underappreciated the harms from practices like vertical mergers and serial acquisitions, as well as the harms to workers, unquote. He highlighted. Quote again, a generation of these deals has suppressed worker pay, increased prices, and embrittled, that's an interesting word, our supply chain, embrittled our supply. I've never heard that word before, but I guess it's a good one and appropriate in this context. The Revolving Door Project tweeted actually, a quote by Lena Khan. So the quote was, today at FTC and at Justice ATR are issuing the final 2023 merger guidelines. Thank you to the thousands of people who submitted public comments, ensuring we could undertake this work with a deeper understanding of the real-life stakes of merger enforcement. So when they talk about a merger here, they're not talking about a merger of the FTC and the Justice Department. What they're talking about is guidelines for investigating and for prosecuting, and for deciding to allow certain proposed mergers by the private sector. In other words, what are the guidelines for approving mergers, or denying mergers and acquisitions? And the guidelines they previously had were very ineffective, in doing that. It was basically a gambling casino type of environment whatever was proposed by the private sector, the FTC and the Justice Department would basically rubber stamp for a very long time, for decades. So that was the tweet. Lena Khan tweet was the tweet that was quoted. And the statement quoting it was, today the @Justice ATR and the @ATC released their final merger guidelines, an incredible end cap to what has been a phenomenal year for trust busting. Now, Lena Khan has developed quite a reputation as a trust buster. First one to develop such a reputation. Well, really, I think there may have been some good people doing this sort of thing in the 1950s and 1960s, but certainly she's the best trust buster since those days, and maybe since the days of the New Deal. Open Markets Institute legal director Sandeep Vaheesan also praised the agencies behind the new guidelines, which he said, quote, put fealty to law front and center again, seek to implement congressional intent instead of their own ideological preferences, unquote. Whoa, what a good idea, implementing congressional intent. That's wonderful. I guess an old idea has come back into government. By relying on market share tests for deciding the legality of certain mergers, the new guidelines are more faithful to the Clayton Act than the 2010 horizontal merger guidelines were, unquote, Vaheesan explained. Quote, they're also more in accord with empirical research on the effects of mergers and acquisitions, which finds that corporate consolidation can harm democratic balances in institutions, as well as workers, producers, and consumers. Quote, in our comments on the draft guidelines, we call on the DOJ and the FTC in the final guidelines to adopt lower market share tests to cover consolidations outside the most highly concentrated markets, and to reject unequivocally an efficiencies defense for presumptively illegal mergers, unquote. That is so important because the companies would come in and they would always make a case for the efficiency of the merger they wanted approved, or the acquisition, they wanted approved. And the efficiencies defenses were really kind of ignored, the intent of the law, which was to prevent economic concentration. In other words, the law doesn't say anything about allowing concentration based on efficiencies. That was something that crept into the enforcement of the law, over a period of time, without really any legal justification from the Clayton Act. But also, the claims of efficiencies often made by companies that were going to merge with each other did not turn out to be empirically true. Lots of times the supposed efficiencies were simply disappeared when they started firing a whole bunch of employees who had a lot of knowledge about how the original 2 or 3 companies were run. And of course, these employees were fired, so the knowledge of how to do things left these companies. So often they were far less efficient than the original 2 companies were. Anyway, there was very rarely any empirical proof of a gain, in efficiency, because when the mergers were approved by the federal government, there were no mandates for the companies to report back and to prove that they did gain, in efficiency. So the efficiency stuff was a dodge to begin with and was a stretch in the law anyway that never should have occurred. Quote, although the agencies stuck with their original approach in the final document, these guidelines are a material improvement over the status quo and will help the two agencies do a better job of stopping and deterring harmful corporate consolidation going forward. And there's Chris Murphy tweeting in approval, of what Lena Khan had to say also. The new at DOJ and at FTC merger. Who is Chris Murphy? He's the senator from Connecticut, for those who don't know, are a game changer for antitrust enforcement and a clear break from the neoliberal economics of the 70s and 80s. Someone in Congress actually implicitly
I
attacked
got it, sweetheart.
the neoliberal economics of the 70s and 80s. Wow, that's different. But I wouldn't put too much store in that because Chris Murphy is probably a neoliberal.
Yeah, it's okay, Lexi.
Now mergers will be judged based on whether they work for consumers and workers. This is good news. It's a good hope. Let's make sure it really happens. The guidelines released Monday reflect feedback the agencies received after putting out a draft in July. FTC Chair Lena Khan expressed gratitude for the thousands of comments submitted by American workers, consumers, entrepreneurs, farmers, business owners, and other members of the public, stressing that, quote, this input directly informed the guidelines and allowed us to pursue this work with a deeper understanding of the real-life stakes of merger enforcement. And Attorney General Merrick Garland, not to be denied his say in this matter, said in a statement that the guidelines, quote, provide transparency into Justice Department action and pledge that the DOJ will continue to vigorously enforce the laws that safeguard competition and protect all Americans, unquote. That last statement is something of a joke because the last time we saw vigorous enforcement of the laws was many years ago. The last time I can remember is when they got after Enron and brought it down in the early 2000s. So this article was by Jessica Corbett. I thought it was a pretty good one. Let's move to the second article, which is not so good news from the corruption standpoint. It is this article from Portside. The article originally appeared in Jacobin, actually. It's by Lisa Featherstone. And headline is Pro-Israel Billionaires are spending big to oust socialists from office. Across the country, pro-Israel groups and billionaires are trying to stop the anti-war movement pushing for a ceasefire in Gaza by bringing down its elected leaders, including Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar. These are fights the left can win with Papu can't complete the tagline here, but maybe it'll be in the article and we'll get to complete it. And here's a picture of Netanyahu meeting with an AIPAC delegation at his office in Jerusalem, November 29th, 2023. AIPAC openly does this, meets with a foreign prime minister, and I guess it's to discuss their common interests in getting rid of these terrible socialists who are standing up for Palestinian rights. I'll bet they talked a lot about that when they met with him November 29th, 2023. Now, I'd like to have the minutes of that meeting, and the reason why I would is because that would be clear evidence of a foreign power interfering in the domestic politics of the United States. That happens routinely in the case of Israel. And everybody needs to know about it because it's illegal. Socialists, in elected office, are standing up for Palestinian rights and demanding a ceasefire, in Gaza. I don't know if I accept that all these are socialists. I know many of them were members of the Democratic Socialists of America. I'm not sure that those Democratic Socialists are really socialists, but that's a story for another day. Socialists in elected office are standing up for Palestinian rights and demanding a ceasefire in Gaza. A handful of billionaires rejecting this progressive and popular agenda are trying hard to take down these anti-war lawmakers. As well, many conservative and centrist Democratic candidates are launching primary challenges against them, hoping to be the recipients of big campaign cash from the American Israel Public Affairs Committee and similar pro-Israeli groups. AIPAC and its donors, like-minded organizations and big donors, told the New York Times they're going to spend big, probably far more than in previous election cycles, to defeat anyone standing up for Palestine. Many of their targets are members of Democratic Socialists of America or close allies of the organization. So, are close allies of the organization really socialists? That's another question to be considered. But one very important point here is that this whole threat would be totally defeated if voters were to apply the dump the corruption rule. There would be no problem if voters were to apply that particular rule, because it would get rid of all the candidates who were taking money from AIPAC or its sister organizations or its allies. It's essential, going on with the article, it's essential that we defend those elected officials who are providing principled leadership to the left in the midst of Israel's brutal assault on the Gaza Strip, which has so far killed more than 19,000 Palestinians. I think it must be up to 20,000 now.
Yes, it's up to 20,000, yes.
Yes, regrettably up to 20,000 now. Israeli President Benjamin Netanyahu's allies have plenty of money, but politically they're flailing as international support for Israel's war gradually declines in the face of its indiscriminate bombing of civilians. By the way, I have to mention here, when it comes to certain civilians, it's not so indiscriminate. In other words, Israel has purposefully targeted UN employees in Gaza, various kinds of intellectuals, important people, literary people in Gaza, and journalists, reporters. They've killed a huge number of journalists in this war, and not as a result of the generalized bombing, but they've targeted these people. They found out where they are, and they've assassinated them. So it's not all indiscriminate, but when it's not indiscriminate, it's often assassination of civilians that they have no business attacking. The call for a permanent ceasefire in Gaza is broadly popular, as are the economic justice issues these office holders champion. So these should be winnable fights if the left can stay organized. A 61%, let's get organized behind the dump the corruption campaign, and if we did, then all these AIPAC efforts would fail automatically. A 61% majority of likely U.S. voters believes the United States should support a ceasefire, while only 28% oppose such a move, even though only 62 members of Congress have publicly called for one so far. Well, if 61% of likely voters believes the United States should support a ceasefire, why do we have only 62 members of Congress who've publicly called for one so far? obviously it's because a lot of congressmen are afraid of AIPAC and what it might do. But as rich as AIPAC is, everybody needs to remember AIPAC can't go after all congressmen. They don't have that much in financial resources. They'll be hard pressed to defeat the 5 original members of the squad if they go after them with $100 million. I don't think that's going to dislodge them from office. But if they had to go after 150 congressmen or 280 congressmen or 61% of the House members, they certainly would never have enough money to do that. Even the billionaires wouldn't be willing to expend that much money to defeat all these people. Anyway, Michigan Representative Rashida Tlaib may be number 1 on AIPAC's enemies list. The DSA endorsed Congresswoman, who's the only Palestinian American to serve in Congress, to serve in the House of Representatives in the U.S., has faced censure from her colleagues for her Palestinian advocacy. 2 Detroit Senate candidates say that AIPAC offered them $20 million to abandon their Senate races and run against her. Of course, if one of them accepted, it might have killed 2 birds with 1 stone, because that might have opened the way for a Republican senator to be elected, in Michigan, in order to take the vacant Debbie Stabenow the seat. Both refused in pretty indignant terms, and despite the hefty political bounty on her head, Tlaib still doesn't have a serious primary opponent. AIPAC has for now resorted to running attack ads against her through its dark money arm, equating her advocacy for a ceasefire in Gaza and her participation in anti-war protests with enabling terrorists. AIPAC has a genuine challenger for Missouri Representative Cori Bush, a Democratic Socialist activist from St. Louis, who introduced a House bill calling for a ceasefire. Much of the anti-war movement has mobilized around this House bill. In an especially depraved move, however, Wesley Bell, the prosecutor who investigated the Ferguson Police Department after the infamous police murder of Michael Brown, switched his attentions from unseating far-right Senator Josh Hawley, a worthy goal, to launching a primary campaign against Bush, tapping into moneyed ire over her ceasefire bill. Most of the squad will be targeted in 2024. AIPAC remains, as the Nation put it in 2022, quote, desperate to defeat Summer Lee, unquote, the freshman congressman from the Pittsburgh area in Pennsylvania. The group has tried backing both primary challengers and Republicans against the Pennsylvania representative and former DSA member, and it is expected to do so again in 2024. With respect to Minnesota Representative Ilhan Omar, one of the most principled anti-imperialist and pro-Palestinian voices in office, and a close ally of DSA members in Congress, faces multiple primary challengers competing for AIPAC funds. That ought to divide the AIPAC funds somewhat and be good for Ilhan. Perhaps most worrisome is the animus against Representative Jamal Bowman of New York. Bowman, ironically, left DSA when many members felt he was not sufficiently supportive of the group's stance on Palestine. But he has turned out to be one of the strongest voices in Washington regarding the urgency of a ceasefire and the injustice of Israel's occupation. Bowman's seat may now be the most imperiled of any squad member, as AIPAC has recruited Westchester County Executive George Latimer to run against him, and Latimer may tap into considerable pro-war sentiment in Bowman's district. Bowman isn't the only New York elected official being targeted. A coalition of billionaires will also be taking aim at several state office holders. A recent report in Hellgate, a local New York City news site, confirmed rumors that had been flying around for months. A group of centrist and right-wing millionaires and billionaires, including Gil Seigler, a rental car mogul, as well as bigger names like Ronald Lauder, who's a Republican diplomat and heir to the Estee Lauder Company, and Theodore J. Tisch, investor and Brown University chancellor, want New York socialists out of office. While these billionaires have disliked DSA's success in expanding renters' rights, the organization's advocacy for Palestine has galvanized even more ruling class opposition. DSA officials under fire include State Senators Jabari Brisport of Brooklyn, Kristen Gonzalez of Queens, as well as assembly members Marcella Mataines and Emily Gallagher from Brooklyn. For full disclosure, I'm a DSA member and live in Brisport's district. I volunteered in his campaigns in the past and plan to do so again. While the New York State Legislature does not set foreign policy, socialist elected officials have been visible at Palestinian solidarity protests. Particular object of ire for the pro-Israel billionaires is Assembly member Zoran Mamdani of Queens, who wrote the, quote, not on our dime, unquote, legislation, which would bar any charity in New York State from funding Israeli settlement activity because the tax-exempt status of nonprofits makes them effectively government-supported. Mamdani also joined a group of legislators and activists on a hunger strike in front of the White House recently, demanding a ceasefire, in Gaza. So here are a group of congresspeople who is serving their constituents and the United States rather courageously in coming out for changes in foreign policy that we desperately need, and these billionaires want to get rid of them because they're supporters of the fascistic Israeli regime and the war crimes that it's committing, in Gaza. It's absolutely disgusting. I have to underline once again that if every voter voted according to the rule, every one of these challenges to representatives who are very valuable would be pushed aside because the people taking their dirty money would be defeated. That would be all there was to it. Speaking of dirty money, I've suggested here, on numerous occasions, any predictions for 2024. I don't like to predict until I know a lot more about what's going on with the Dump the Corruption campaign. That could overturn all predictions, Steve. It really could. But in any case, speaking of corruption, I've suggested now on numerous occasions that Robert F. Kennedy's Jr. stance, on Israel, may be motivated by more than principle, but by some funds from the Adelson fortune. Cannot prove that yet, but I think that's what's really behind, the silly positions that he's been taking. If this were found, to be the case, he would stand in violation of the rule, of course, and people who believed in the Dump the Corruption campaign would have to vote against him, automatically. But there are other reasons to vote against him also, and I'm going to begin to examine some of these other reasons, right now. Let's start with a very brief portion of the interview RFKJ recently had with Crystal, and Sagar. And let me see where I am on this, the part I want. Okay, let's see. I'm very close to it now.
Filibuster in order to secure, enshrining Roe versus Wade as the law of the land, which is something that's been floated for a lot of years.
Sorry, moved it back too far. I got too enthusiastic about this. Okay,
believe that, and I don't think anything is a satisfactory solution. But I think ultimately we have to trust the moms. We have to trust women. Oh, and that. But I will.
That's after it.
The performance to compete with all the other people, and that's why they're successful.
What about a standard? If we say that all censorship has to abide within the First Amendment at all social media, you can operate however you want. It's just that in terms of censorship, removal of content.
Well, here's what I would do as president.
Yeah.
Okay. The day, and I'll do this the day that I go in, is meant for people to have autonomy over their own bodies, and I understand also the that there's a countervailing in. Have devoted their lives to protecting that, and I think they should be heard. I have people in my family that I grew up with that who I was very close to had that notion. I understand it, and we all can respect each other.
So let's go ahead and put this next element up on the screen. You mentioned medical freedom being something that's always been very important to you, at least years. I'm sure you saw probably this story, which was
President Biden doing.
Nothing
as far as we.
That's why I wonder if you're going to be different. That's the question.
What are your ideas?
Well, I mean, one idea is to try to eliminate the filibuster in order to secure, enshrining Roe versus Wade as the law of the land, which is something that's been floated for a lot of years.
Okay, so she suggests, getting rid of the filibuster so they could get, a Roe v. Wade law through. And here's his reply.
Yeah, I would not end the filibuster. I think those kind of procedural tampering with these long-standing democratic institutions in Congress,
the filibuster, of course, is not a democratic institution. Its essence is that it's undemocratic institution. It is there in order to block laws representing the popular will from getting through Congress. It is a hedge against democracy that has been developed over many years of history, of the Republic. It first occurred, I'm forgetting the exact date now, but it was sometime in the 1830s or so. But it was never a serious threat in those years, to democracy. It began to be used much more frequently during the 1950s and 1960s, during that period of civil rights activism. But even then, filibusters could be overcome, essentially, relatively easily. But there was a reform in 1970 which was supposed to be there to liberalize the filibuster. It was something, that Robert Byrd got through the Congress when, for some time, he was the majority leader, of the Democratic Party. On the one hand, he made it easier to beat a filibuster by lowering the votes that were required from 2/3 of the Senate to 60 votes. A few votes less. But he made it easier to do filibusters because it was no longer necessary for people to stand and make speeches and wear diapers for days when they wanted to, block a bill. he set up the rules in such a way that it was possible for senators to have their staffs phone in, okay, a filibuster, phone in their intent, okay, to do a filibuster. And that was enough, okay, to kill a bill. And so in modern times, it's been the threat of that has paralyzed all kinds of legislation that's very good in Congress. Now, here's how Bobby answers the suggestion of getting rid of the filibuster.
Get turned against you on the next term.
Would you though want to?
So that's it. He says it's a democratic institution, but his practical, so he wants to defend it because it's a democratic institution. He must know very well it's not a democratic institution. There's nothing democratic about it. It's the soul of undemocracy. Okay. But his practical reason is, well, okay, if we get rid of it, then the next time it turns, then it's going to be the Republican turns, and they're just going to reinstate everything we put in. By the way, his view of this has been something that has long been expressed by many Democratic senators. So at this point, what I want to introduce is a couple of pieces of my own that I wrote actually back in the day in 2009. They're only accessible now through the Wayback Machine of the Internet Archive, but I can still share them, and that's what I'm going to do now. Okay, so the first one is first one is called Drive a Stake Through Its Heart. Let me get rid of this plea for a donation. My old blog was called, it was a blog on knowledge and knowledge management, and all life is problem solving. Okay, it was the name of the blog. And the name of this particular post was Drive a Stake Through Its Heart. It was February 7th, 2009. Okay, so it's obviously nearly 14 years old in February. Is that 14 years old? No, almost 15 years old. On February 7th, it'll be 15 years old. There's a picture of Bela Lugosi, the original Dracula, okay, in movies. The Republican tax cut wingnut Steve Forbes once said of the IRS, quote, "The only thing we can do with this hideous beast is to kill it, drive a stake through its heart, bury it, and hope it never rises again to terrorize the American people," unquote. Well, I don't share this view in relation to the IRS. I do think the sentiment is perfectly crafted to express my feelings about the Senate filibuster. The filibuster is an extra constitutional travesty that has too often undermined the power of the U.S. Congress to express the will of the people. It has worked to require supermajorities whenever the United States has to get anything important done. The need for supermajorities, in turn, A, has stopped action favored by a majority in many areas. B, where action is possible, it is often watered down or gutted its effectiveness because the need to compromise with minority opponents of legislation has required agreement to loopholes, fine print, and exceptions by the majority, and perhaps most important of all, the need for supermajorities has prevented later adjustments by the majority to errors in legislation and to its unanticipated effects, because very often an administration may get only one bite at the apple in each major area of concern. This was a particular problem, by the way, in 2009, because it fast became apparent that the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, the AARA, the stimulus bill of 2009, wasn't sufficient to get us out of the recession quickly. it was passed in February, and it became apparent by May or June that it wasn't going to work, that it was too small. But of course, the administration got only one bite at this apple. It could never come back, assuming even that Obama would have liked to have come back. I think he probably would have liked to, because I don't think he was very happy about the House of Representatives turning Republican so decisively in 2010. And if he could have passed a further stimulus bill, he probably could have stopped that. And I think he probably would have wanted to. Okay, but of course, even though people were talking about a second bite at a stimulus bill in June of 2009, that was a forlorn hope. They couldn't even get their next major project passed, which was healthcare reform, of course. They weren't able to do that. The, quote, one bite at the apple problem, unquote, is made much worse by the need for supermajorities. Legislatures can't follow a continuous improvement, learning-based approach to legislating, a rational approach to things that corporations can do, our legislatures can't do. They need to get it right the first time. But that's a virtual impossibility, because politics and economics deal with complex systems, and none of us know enough about such systems to do it right the first time without pure blind luck. The current stimulus package, the coming healthcare bill, the future energy and environmental legislation, all are sure to be flawed and to require continuous improvement, just as we're finding with the TARP legislation. Yeah, you remember the bailouts from TARP. There were a lot of problems with that. We knew about them immediately. No possibility for continuous improvement. But we won't be able to do that improvement because the lack of a supermajority won't allow it, and because if there is a need for improvement, that very fact will ensure that the minority's political interest will impel them toward preventing it. And again, we have to remember the Democrats had a huge majority in 2009, 2010 in the House, and a huge majority in the Senate, which for most of that time was either at 58 or 59 votes, and which for a few months was even at 60 votes, so that it could have overcome a filibuster if Democrats could have come to agreement among themselves. Because the lack of a supermajority won't allow it, because if there's a need for improvement, that very fact will ensure that the minority's political interest will impel them toward preventing it. How do we handle complex systems in non-legislative environments in order to be successful? The best method we know is to develop a solution to a problem by comparing alternatives and selecting what appears to be the best, to monitor the results closely, and if those don't meet our expectations, then recognize another problem and go back for a second or third or fourth bite at the apple in order to continuously improve our results until we meet some standards we had in mind from the beginning. The biggest problem with the need for supermajorities in Congress is they make legislating a, quote, crapshoot, unquote, because they shut the door on any realistic possibility of proceeding along the path of correcting errors. Instead, supermajorities only allow us to pass an inferior solution to a problem in the first place, and when its results are unsatisfying to everyone, to blame the ins for failing, get the outs in, and give them a chance to try to get their own solutions through the same obstructionist process. In the 21st century, a society that can't adapt to error, which is after all a human condition, cannot long survive. And the United States is in for a very sharp decline, because unless we can do something about a legislative process that is incapable of continuously evaluating and improving the result of its previous decisions. That something is getting rid of the filibuster and returning to the constitutional requirement of a simple majority in each House of Congress to pass new legislation. Getting rid of the filibuster is easy to do if we have the will and are willing to abandon the mythology of the desirability of a mobilist government that thwarts the will of the majority. The instrument of doing it is a maneuver that's been given the name of, quote, the nuclear option. It was proposed by the Republican Senate in 2005 to overcome Democratic filibusters of presidential judicial nominees intended to block Senate confirmations. When Bill Frist, the Senate Majority Leader at the time, the Republican Senate Majority Leader, got ready to trigger the option, which would have had the consequence of eliminating the rule or precedent underlying the filibuster, a bipartisan so-called, quote, gang of 14, unquote, 7 Democratic, 7 Republican senators arrived at a compromise, which got the Republicans what they wanted and saved the filibuster for posterity. How wonderful. The compromise was to avert a vote on the, quote, of the nuclear option, give up the filibuster on some of the nominees, table the consideration of others, and save the filibuster for, quote, extraordinary circumstances, unquote. 2005 conflict wasn't the first time the nuclear option was attempted. It was moved on 10 previous occasions by various people, but each time it was attempted, it was either defeated or a compromise was worked out to save it for future use. The procedure for implementing the nuclear option isn't a difficult one. Here are the steps involved to exercise it. Quote, during a filibuster, a senator makes a point of order calling for a vote on the measure being considered by the Senate. The presiding author of the Senate, most often the Vice President of the United States, makes a parliamentary ruling upholding the point of order and citing the Constitution of the United States rather than previous Senate rules, which uphold the right of unlimited debate as its precedent supporting the ruling. 3, a supporter of the filibuster will then, quote, appeal from the chair by asking whether the chair's decision will stand as the judgment of the Senate. 4, an opponent of the filibuster then must move to table the appeal. Since motions to table are not debatable, the Senate immediately votes on the tabling and decides by simple majority vote. If a majority decides to table the ruling of the chair that the filibuster is unconstitutional and that the particular majority vote is enough to bring a bill to vote and pass it, and to pass it, it is upheld. 7, by its action in upholding the chair, the Senate will have established a new precedent, namely that filibusters are unconstitutional and that all legislation thenceforth may be passed by majority vote following a point of order calling for a vote. In the last national election in the United States, I, like so many others, voted for change. This was, of course, the 2008 election in both economic and foreign policy, which means that I voted for Democratic candidates for office right down the line. I wanted Democrats to have their fair shot at fixing the American economy and ending the foreign policy debacles of the Bush administration. I didn't vote for more of the abysmally failed Republican thinking in either of these two areas, and since I view any input from them as clueless, reality-denying, and sure to result in more people losing their jobs and their dreams, I certainly didn't vote for that political party whose policies have failed to have any serious inputs into the recovery package. Now I ask myself, why are they having serious inputs into the recovery legislation? Talking about the Republicans. Why are they capable of persuading people to limit the overall size of the stimulus to under $1 trillion and to eliminate or reduce funding in the Recovery Act for Head Start, education for the disadvantaged, school improvement, child nutrition, firefighters, transportation, security administration, Coast Guard, prisons, cops, hiring, violence against women, NASA, NSF, Western Area Power Administration, CDC, food stamps, public transit, and school construction. In short, why do they have the continuing influence that I and a majority of Americans voted against them having? Why haven't we been able to get the ins, quote, and quote, unquote, out, quote, unquote? The simple answer is the existence of the filibuster. Now, I'm well aware of all the arguments out there defending the filibuster on grounds that it is an important element protecting the minority against the tyranny of the majority in the United States. I don't buy that nonsense at all. None of the other major democracies in the world have anything like the filibuster, and I don't see tyrannies in any of them. Also, the United States has a surfeit of anti-democratic elements in its political system protecting minorities. We don't need an extra constitutional institution like the filibuster. We have too little democracy in the United States anyway, not too much. And we need to redress the balance if we're to adapt to the challenges that face us. What is the filibuster worth? The filibuster is not worth the job of a single laid off American. Where did I get that from? I got that from Bismarck, who said what did he say? He said something like, the intervention in a certain contest for African colonies wasn't worth the bones of a single German grenadier. A very famous quote. So I worked it over just a little. The filibuster, it's not worth the job of a single laid-off American. I think it is not worth the job of a single laid-off American. So let's use the nuclear option. Let's use it this week. Let's use it for the sake of the recovery bill. Let's use it for the sake of all the legislation the Obama administration has yet to pass. At that time, many of us had still high hopes for the Obama administration. Let's use it for the sake of all the changes our country will need in this very challenging century. And finally, let's use it to drive a stake through the filibuster's heart and prevent that relic of a simpler and slower moving age from continuing to sap the life-sustaining energy of political innovation out of our republic. Shoo. So, if you notice, it said continuing, that would be continued, and I did continue it. And I continued it in my very next blog post, which was entitled specifically, Barack, get the filibuster. That's the change we need. This was written one day later on February 8th, 2009. And here was a graphic, of Barack saying, yes, we can. You remember those days, I'm sure. In some previous political blogs, I've talked about getting bipartisanship the wrong way around and how and why to get rid of the filibuster. And by the way, I think Bobby Kennedy is implicitly running a bipartisan campaign, and he's getting it the wrong way around, but that's another issue. And how and why to get rid of the filibuster. In this blog, I want to intensify my message on these issues and also direct it, to Barack Obama. Today, and maybe we ought to direct it, today to Bobby Kennedy. Today, Paul Krugman weighed in on the Senate's compromise stimulus bill and his evaluation of it. He said, the short answer, to appease the centrists, a plan that was already too small and too focused on ineffective tax cuts has been made significantly smaller and even more focused on tax cuts. Quote, he was talking about the ARRA. Quote, according to the CBO's estimates, we're facing an output shortfall of almost 14% of GDP over the next 2 years. That was 2009 and 2010, or another $2 trillion. Others, such as Goldman Sachs, are even more pessimistic. So the original $800 billion plan was too small, especially because a substantial share consisted of tax cuts that probably would have added little to demand. The plan should have been at least 50% larger. That, of course, would have been $1.6 trillion. That was smaller than the recommendation of Christine Romer, then president of the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors in the Obama administration, who had recommended a stimulus of $1.8 trillion, which never even got to Obama's desk because it was blocked by Larry Summers, who thought that a stimulus plan worth more than $1 trillion wasn't really passable at that time. Why not passable? Because of the filibuster. That's why. There were 50 Democratic votes for a much larger stimulus if Obama had wanted one. Everybody was scared crapless at that time. They were afraid the economy was going down into the deepest tank since the 1930s. At least the stimulus bill was enough to stop that. Quote, now the centrists have shaved off $86 billion in spending, much of it among the most effective and most needed parts of the plan, in particular aid to state governments, which are in desperate straits. They were cutting jobs right and left, is both fast because it prevents spending cuts rather than having to start up new projects, and effective because it would in fact be spent. Plus, state and local governments are cutting back on essentials, so the social value of this spending would be high. But in the name of mighty centrism, 40 billion of that aid has been cut out. Quote, my first cut says that the changes to the Senate bill will ensure that we have at least 600,000 fewer Americans employed over the next 2 years. So the filibuster, he was saying, was worth not the jobs of one single American, but the jobs of 600,000 Americans. And of course, he was making an underestimate. He always does. In my last post, I said that retaining the Senate's filibuster isn't worth the job of a single laid-off American, and certainly not worth the jobs of 600,000 Americans. Nor is it worth a shortfall in GDP of $2 trillion over the next 2 years. But worse than that, it's not worth the cost of breaking a filibuster when Barack's energy program comes up for passage. It's not worth the cost of breaking the filibuster when national health care comes up for a vote. It's not worth the cost of breaking filibusters when we try finally to fix the damage wrought by Katrina, or to fix the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or to get the SEC, the FDA, the EPA, and the Consumer Product Safety Commission working again. I might have added the Federal Trade Commission working again, or to fix all the other agencies of government gutted by the Republicans and shortchanged by the Clinton administration. It's not worth the cost we'll pay when we finally move to ensure that well-to-do people again pay their fair share of taxes, when we try once again to restore the American public school system to its one-time glory, or when we try to ensure that every young American gets their shot at a good university education. No, I don't want to attempt to build bipartisanship and keep the Senate filibuster and pay these heavy costs. I didn't vote for that. I voted for change. If bipartisanship is part of this change, then fine, but bipartisanship is a process, and I want results more than I want process, especially extra-constitutional process like the filibuster and bipartisanship. I don't think there are very many Americans who will think this is a good trade-off either. Bipartisanship and the filibuster just ain't worth the American dream. Maintaining the power of Susan Collins and Olympia Snow and Joe Lieberman and Ben Nelson and Arlen Specter and George Voinovich just ain't worth the American dream or even a month's postponement of it. So I say to Barack Obama, first things first, you want change, real change in Washington, then getting the filibuster is the first change you need. After that, all the other changes will be 100 times easier, because you'll put together programs that can and will be successful in putting the country back to work and making it strong again. Tell Senator Reid this, Harry, we need to get that filibuster, and we need to do it because we were elected to deliver change, and we're going to be accountable if we don't deliver good change, quote unquote, effective change, quote unquote. And they were accountable. They got schlonged in the House in 2010. The Republicans aren't going to be blamed if things don't work. I am. You are. We are. Well, he was not blamed. But Harry lost some Senate seats, and Nancy lost a whole boatload of House seats. This is our chance, and we can't let an extra constitutional and democratic process stand in the way of our getting results. We've got to do all we can to enact our best program. Then if we fail the country, the people can try something else. But let us not fail because we allowed an anti-democratic and extra-constitutional process enshrined by previous Congresses to stop us from taking our best shot. Let us be accountable, and then if we fail, let the Republicans be accountable for what they do. That's what democracy is about. Let's at long last have some democracy. Let's give the public what they really voted for, not bipartisanship, not the filibuster, but a second New Deal, and this time one that won't stop at the water's edge, but that will deliver the American dream. So that's what I wrote back in 2009. Those were before my MMT days. You can imagine how trenchant they would have been if I was informed, about MMT, in those days. But it's important to apply this stuff to Bobby Kennedy and what he said. A lot of Democratic senators at the time were saying we have to preserve the filibuster because if we don't, when the Republicans get in power, then they're just going to change everything again, do all kinds, of terrible things. There used to be a different attitude which the Democratic Party had, a much different attitude. That attitude was expressed by Harry Hopkins, if I'm not mistaken. I think it was Harry Hopkins, back in the late 1930s. He said, tax and tax, spend and spend, elect, and elect. In other words, he said, if we keep taxing the rich and we keep on spending for the poor, and for the middle class, then we will keep on electing Democrats, and the Republicans won't get a shot at turning things around. And Harry Hopkins was right. That attitude was right from 1933 through 1946, when the Republicans were elected to run the Congress. They soon lost both houses of Congress. They had 2 terms in. They started doing bad things like the Taft-Hartley law, which the country at large did not particularly like. And they also screwed up in some of their foreign policy stances, and they were threatening Social Security, but never got to do anything against it. And so they were voted out. And even though they had some share in government from 1946 to 1964, we have to remember that Democrats ruled the House of Representatives from 1954 to 1995. The Republicans finally won again in 1994, when Gingrich, led them to victory. But the Democrats had control of the House for 40 years. For 40 years. So, the point is, when Democrats did represent much more than they do today, the majority of the population, they got elected far more often than they do today. So they have politically suffered by playing the games that they've been playing since the late 1970s, in the 1980s. These games have failed. They have to go back to square one. Now, Bobby is very defensive. He thinks, and he's prepared for, basically, psychologically, a quick turn. That maybe he's going to have some initial success if he gets elected to the presidency in certain areas. But he's not expecting a Congress that's going to support him. He's expecting a Congress that's going to fight him. Why is he expecting a Congress that's going to fight him? Because he's not leading a movement for democratic reform and democratic change that's going to help people from the economic point of view. He's talking more democracy. He's talking getting rid of the corruption in government. While, as I say, he's likely taking money from the ageless and fortune, and he's certainly taking some money from other big money donors. He's not a bottom-up candidate yet. He's not, a Democratic candidate, small d Democratic candidate. If he were that kind of candidate, if he were trying to mobilize the public he would have confidence that if he did win, and if he pulled in a Congress with him, if he had coattails for a Congress. I remember the days when President had coattails, when they were huge coattails. Franklin Roosevelt had huge coattails, of course. Even Eisenhower had some coattails. Even Truman had some coattails. Even Lyndon Johnson had some coattails, at least in 1964. Okay. But now presidents don't have much in the way of coattails in Congress. Okay. And so what you have is you have a situation where there's not a unified, coherent movement supporting change when it comes to legislation. And the result is that nothing will fundamentally change in this country. And that's why this country is rapidly becoming a truly decrepit political system which cannot do anything to adapt. The problems of adaptation are even worse today than we were when I wrote those 2 blog posts in 2009. They're much worse today. Major party candidates dare to promise that nothing will fundamentally change. Okay. And Robert Kennedy is not saying that anything will fundamentally change when it comes to economics. He's not running an economics-led campaign, is he? He's talking about corruption in government. He's talking about doing something in the regulatory sphere that will clean up the government and domination of the corporations. That's all good. And it will do something for the economy. But he's not pledging a great deal of economic reform or coming out for it. We haven't seen that yet from him. And maybe that's what explains his fear that if we don't safeguard the filibuster, there will quickly be a turn to the Republicans, and then they'll do all kinds of horrible things the next time they get in, because maybe we won't hold the Congress for more than 2 years. That's not the way the Democratic Party used to approach things, and it's not the way that any political party ought to approach things today. They should be approaching things so that they want to have fundamental change. And if they make that fundamental change, and if that fundamental change works, then they will be in office for a very long time, and there will be no turn. And they will also get to pass more and more and more good legislation until they are done, because there will be no filibuster to stop them. So I hope I've given you all kinds of reasons for noting that when Bobby Kennedy says what he does concerning the filibuster, that he's full of it. I also want to talk about some other reasons, some other things that are wrong, okay, with Bobby Kennedy. It won't take too long to talk about them. But here's a list of Kennedy deal breakers. His position on the filibuster. His position on Medicare for all. He's already said he's not going to fight for it. His position on taking big money. He's using the old cliche. Okay. I can't take a knife to a gunfight. That's basically what he's saying. I've got to have some big money of my own to compete, okay, with the others. Bernie Sanders proved you don't have to have really big money of your own. You can raise huge quantities of money with small donations if people believe that you're going to represent them, that you're going to fundamentally change things. His problem is he hasn't given people that kind of impression. Then, of course, there's his position on Israel, his support for war crimes, his support for ethnic cleansing, his support for genocide, in supporting the Netanyahu government coming away. Oh, now he's saying he's not responsible for the Netanyahu government, that he's not in support, okay, of the Netanyahu government. If he's not in support of the Netanyahu government, why isn't he coming out for U.S. policy to change and for the Biden administration to immediately cut off the funding to Israel so the Netanyahu government has to stop this stuff? He's abdicating responsibility for Netanyahu, but he won't advocate for the things that will cause Netanyahu to stop. His position on debts and deficits and fiscal responsibility and federal spending, he has said enough to indicate that he has a very cautious approach, that all he wants to do to raise more money, is to tax more, that he believes the national debt is a problem, that our big deficits are problems, that fiscal responsibility lies in either trimming spending or taxing more. He's a version of the old progressive thinking, on economics. He's not, an MMTer. He's given every indication that he knows nothing about the MMT approach to economics. In my terms, that alone is disqualification for the presidency. Of course, the other things are more serious issues to people. I understand that. But between his positions on all these things, or among his positions on all these things, if he were president and he was stuck to those particular positions, and here comes position number 6, his position on Americans coming together across the party lines. This is, of course, the bipartisanship position. I've already said in my blog posts, I don't care much when it comes to bipartisanship. If bipartisanship would help us to pass good bills that create fundamental change here in America, I'd be for that kind of bipartisanship. But the kind of bipartisanship that is mostly pursued in Washington always makes it a good idea for ordinary Americans to keep their hands on their wallets, because the normal bipartisanship we see in Washington is bipartisanship that does things for the rich and robs most Americans. So I'm not primarily for Americans coming together across party lines. I'm for Americans coming together around the real issues, some of which I've mentioned with respect to the other deal breakers. Okay. So that's what I want to say about the Bobby Kennedy candidacy. And of course, if it proves he is taking big money from the Adelsons, or from others, that proves to be the case, he would be disqualified by the dump the corruption rule, in any case. So I thought that Bobby has a very promising campaign in some respects, but there's now a big catalog of things that are against him and that disqualify him for the presidency alone, if dump the corruption is not enough to make you conclude that he should be opposed. Okay. D, you got anything to add?
I was going to say it's just so disappointing because when he started to run, there was enthusiasm. And the more he opened his mouth, it just became so disappointing.
Yeah, the more he opened his mouth, the worse it got. From the start, I was willing to accept the idea that on the vaccines, he was getting smeared. I still think he was getting smeared, when it came to the vaccines. His ultimate position on vaccines seems like it's reasonable to me. More testing, be more careful, make sure about the effects of the vaccines. I think history is proving him to be right about that. But, on these other issues, the longer he talks, the worse he looks in terms of his position, okay, on these other issues. He hasn't had a good statement now in a very long time. Now, in the Crystal and Sager interview, he seemed to move a little, on the Israel position. He said that he doesn't approve of the Netanyahu regime. He's not responsible for what they do. He said that if someone could show him how, he would be for a two-state solution. Okay, I didn't like that comment because if he were to be elected as the president of the United States, it would be his job to work with the various parties that have a stake in this to work out something that would be acceptable to all parties or to sufficient parties that Israel could be coerced into accepting it. So that would be his job, okay, as president. So he doesn't have many ideas about how to do that job. So he turns to Crystal and asks her what are her ideas. Come on, that's not acceptable for someone who wants us to trust him to be the president of the United States.
Exactly.
He has to be on top of this. And he can't just parrot the lines from Rabbi Shmuley or from the Adelson money.
I know, of all people.
Yeah, I mean, of all people, Sheldon Adelson's wife, one of the main people behind the settler movement that's causing all the trouble.
Mm-hmm.
And he sold out, apparently, to that money. Now, he may come up, he may finally notice what I'm saying, and he may say, this guy's been smearing me. I'm not taking any of that money. I'd love to see that happen. I'd love to see that happen. But I'll bet he's taking other big money. Okay, to give him his due, he is trying to start up a small donor campaign. He says he has 250,000 volunteers now. That can be very powerful in running a small donor campaign. We've seen the power it has because it worked for Bernie. If when Bernie found out the Democratic Party was cheating him, if he had made the move then that Bobby Kennedy made, declare himself an independence, and he had dropped out of the primary and left that primary to Biden or whoever, and ran, as an independent, his contributions would have continued to be huge. I'm talking about now, it seemed like I was talking about 2020, but this would have applied to 2016 also. If he found out they were cheating him, which they were, and it was blatant, and he found it out, and he ran as an independent in 2016, or as the candidate of the Green Party, he might have won. He certainly would have raised a whole boatload of money. Bernie raised $250 million in 2020 with small dollar donations by, what was it, April or May of that year. It wasn't even close to election time. He probably could have raised 600 or 700 million, which would have been more than enough. More than enough to have financed his message. Could have gotten out. He could have won. It was such a waste. K. Ryan says, RFK is nuts. Steve Wolfbrand said, when I heard his wife committed suicide reading his sex diary about his sex life. Ugh. Well, I don't know if I believe that. It may be true. I don't know about these people. They do funny things. In that area, I lead a simple life. and it's been a very happy one. Okay, I'm happy to say. And I don't keep a sex diary about my sex life. And my wife knows all my secrets. So, anyway, that's it. I'm really down, okay, on RFK. As I consider these things, I'm considering more Cornel West, okay, and Jill Stein. I've developed a significant amount of respect for Jill Stein, over the years. But neither Cornel nor Jill is going to win without the Dump the Corruption campaign.
Mm-hmm.
They need that to equalize the electoral playing field because it would cancel Biden and it would cancel Trump. And it would cancel Bobby. And people would listen to them and hear them. They could get their message out. They have to run. I almost said it down and dirty, but it's not dirty. It's just a down and clean Dump the Corruption campaign, but just a very intense one. Not letting up on any of these candidates who are taking any of the big money. And calling for people to vote in candidates who are not taking the big money and therefore who would be likely to back what they as president want to do, so that there would be room for fundamental change. There would be room for changing our foreign policy completely. There would be room for handling climate change. There would be room for doing all the wonderful things that we want to do here domestically. So, on that note, thank you for saying smash the like button, Steve. Thank you for coming. Thank you for staying. And thank you, everyone. I'm glad to see you here tonight. And yeah, I see no viable candidate. Let's make Jill and Cornel viable candidates. Let's make them viable with a Dump the Corruption campaign. Okay, that really works. So, I will be back tomorrow. Tomorrow is my neoliberalism show. So I will see you then, and I think that Dee has a really good show that she's planning for us for tomorrow.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I do. It's going to be quite interesting, but it's the reason I chose to do the show is when I heard the video that I watched, and it shows the techniques that the training of the soldiers in Israel. And you hear from 3 different rabbis that speak to the people, the trainees. And it's quite disturbing because you wonder how these soldiers do the things they do. But when you see the training that they get and the stuff that they're indoctrinated with, it truly is mind-boggling. And so we're going to break down some of the stuff that we hear on the tapes.
Okay, we ought to break it down, but we also ought to make sure about the source of this.
I've heard these rabbis speak before.
So
Not
you've heard them say these things before.
Yes, and I was always afraid, and I never really. I was kind of afraid to post certain things because you always get that claim of anti-Semitism and everything else, even if it's coming out of the person's mouth.
Well, what we should be careful of is that these 3 rabbis are not 3 deviants okay, in a broader sea. But I have to say, I don't know what rabbis are doing, but trying to educate, okay, the soldiers. I think, okay, in our military, the role of church people, including rabbis, okay, but also representatives of the Christian churches, okay, as well, and representatives, okay, of Islam, okay, because we have a good many Islamic people, okay, in the army. And so there are probably Muslim chaplains as well. But I think the role of church people in our military is basically pastoral,
Yes.
okay, and it's not a political role. And I
No,
think
no.
that's the way it should be. Okay, and these rabbis are evidently terribly political. And not simply that, they are barbarous.
Twisting, twisting scriptures. But you'd have, and I really thought about it's more of like Zionist rabbis, like a military Zionist trying to tell them, convince them the reasonings that they could do things, horrible things to other people. It's
Yes,
kind of like justifying
basically,
that it's God saying it's okay.
yeah, these people are advocating for murder. And it's just disgusting.
It is.
So anyway, Dee's going to have a blockbuster show tomorrow. I will be joining her, okay, at 8 p.m. And I hope you will be joining her, okay, as well.
Yes. And please hit the like button, subscribe, and share here.
Thank
And
you, Dee. Yes,
and
it's a
buy
lot.
Joe a cup of coffee.
Yeah, buy me a cup of coffee, buy Dee a cup of coffee, and occasionally visit my Patreon account. And thank you all very much for coming. And I'll see you tomorrow.
Yes, and good night to Bonnie. Sleep well.
Okay, I will, and hopefully Bonnie will be much better than I was much better on my second day after the cataract surgery.
Good night.
As well. Okay, so good night, everybody.
Good night. I'll see you later.
Okay.